He thought he was bringing home a quiet bride, but the woman who stepped off the stagecoach carried a secret that could cost him his ranch. A gold ring slipped from Garrett Dawson's fingers and bounced across the wooden church floor. Outside, wagon wheels rattled past the windows, while dozens of townspeople held their breath. Vivian stood at the far end of the aisle, one hand clutching a stack of faded documents, the other trembling just enough to catch the sunlight. Near the front pew, Vernon Hale smiled as if he already knew how this day would end. Then the church door creaked open, and someone unexpected walked in. "Before we begin, tell me where you're watching from and whether you'd have stayed or walked away if you were in Vivian's boots." The stagecoach rolled into Cedar Bluff just as the afternoon sun slipped behind a bank of clouds gathering over the western ridge. Dust followed the wheels in a long golden trail. Men standing outside Miller's General Store glanced up from their coffee cups. A pair of ranch hands paused beside a wagon loaded with fence posts. Even the old hound sleeping beneath the porch lifted its head. Stagecoaches did not bring many surprises to Cedar Bluff. Not anymore. Garrett Dawson stood near the hitching rail across from the station. His hat sat low against the wind. One hand rested on the worn leather of his belt. 38 years old, owner of Broken Creek Ranch, a man who spent more time with horses than people. For weeks he had imagined this moment. A young woman, quiet, gentle, someone who would fill the empty chair across his table and bring a little order back into a house that had forgotten what a family felt like. The coach door opened. Passengers stepped down one by one. An elderly couple, a traveling salesman, a mother carrying a sleeping child. Then the final passenger appeared. Garrett's expression changed. The woman descending the steps was not what he expected. She carried a single brown suitcase with scuffed corners. Her dark traveling dress showed the dust of a long journey. She moved carefully, but not timidly. Her back remained straight. Her chin stayed level. She looked around Cedar Bluff with clear eyes that seemed to measure everything at once. Then she spotted him. Not because she knew his face, because he was staring. She crossed the distance between them before he could decide what to say. "You must be Garrett Dawson." Her voice was calm. "Memphis, not Montana." Garrett removed his hat. "Vivian Brooks?" "That's right." For a second, neither spoke. Wind pushed through the street. A wagon rattled somewhere behind them. Vivian studied him openly. Garrett realized she looked older than he'd imagined. Not old, simply experienced. Like someone who had already lived through enough disappointments to stop fearing new ones. "You came a long way," he finally said. "So did you." His brow furrowed. She glanced toward the stack of letters protruding from his coat pocket. The letters traveled farther than either of us. The corner of Garrett's mouth almost moved. Almost. Then it disappeared. He picked up her suitcase. It felt heavier than it looked. "You hungry?" "A little. There's a cafe down the street. I'd rather see the ranch." That surprised him. Most newcomers wanted food first. Vivian simply adjusted her gloves. "I've spent 6 days sitting down. I'd like to know where I'm supposed to live." The wagon ride to Broken Creek Ranch took nearly an hour. The road wound through open grasslands silvered by autumn wind. Mountains stood blue in the distance. Wild horses grazed along a hillside far from the road. Vivian watched everything. The fence lines, the grazing cattle, the weather building beyond the peaks. She asked few questions. Garrett found himself answering them anyway. "Those mountains catch snow early." She nodded. "The creek runs through the north pasture." Another nod. "You'll see it tomorrow." "I hope so." Nothing about her felt nervous. Nothing felt desperate. That unsettled him more than fear would have. The ranch appeared just before sunset. A weathered house, a red barn, several corrals, smoke rising from a stone chimney. Vivian stepped down from the wagon and looked around quietly. Not impressed, not disappointed, simply taking inventory. Garrett suddenly felt as if she were inspecting him. Inside, supper consisted of beef stew, biscuits, and coffee strong enough to float a horseshoe. They sat across from one another at the kitchen table. The empty chair between them felt occupied by every expectation either of them had carried west. Garrett cleared his throat. "We should discuss arrangements." Vivian set down her spoon. "Good." The word came quickly enough to catch him off guard. She folded her hands. "If I'm staying here, I need a room of my own." Garrett blinked. "All right. I'd like wages for any work beyond normal household duties." His eyebrows lifted. "Wages? If I'm bookkeeping, repairing clothing, helping with ranch records, or anything similar, yes." The kitchen became very quiet. Vivian continued, "And if I decide this arrangement isn't right for me, I want the freedom to leave." The clock on the wall ticked loudly. Garrett stared. She met his gaze without flinching. Most people in Cedar Bluff lowered their eyes eventually. Vivian did not. "You planned all this before arriving?" "I planned it before boarding the coach." The answer was honest, almost irritatingly honest. Garrett leaned back. For months he had imagined welcoming a bride. Instead, he felt as though he had hired a business partner who happened to carry a suitcase. Yet something beneath his frustration felt strangely refreshing. "No one's ever accused you of being shy, have they?" For the first time, a hint of amusement appeared in her eyes. "No." That tiny moment vanished almost immediately, but Garrett noticed it. Later, after supper, he showed her the room at the end of the hall. It contained a narrow bed, a washstand, a small dresser, a single window overlooking the horse pasture. Vivian set her suitcase beside the bed. "This will do." Garrett nodded. "Breakfast at 6, I'll be there." He left her standing in the fading light. Hours later, the ranch settled into silence. The barn lanterns glowed faintly outside. Wind brushed the cottonwoods near the creek. Garrett couldn't sleep. Something about the day kept replaying in his mind. The coach, the handshake, the demands at supper, the way Vivian carried herself. Near midnight, he stepped onto the porch. The air smelled of cold earth and approaching frost. A faint sound drifted from the direction of the barn. At first he thought it was the wind. Then he heard it again. A quiet sob. Garrett froze. The sound came from behind the corral fence. Slowly, he walked closer. Moonlight spilled across the pasture. There, beside the fence rail, stood Vivian. Her back faced him. One hand covered her mouth. The other gripped the top rail so tightly her knuckles looked pale even in the darkness. She was crying. Not loudly, not dramatically, just enough to let the pain escape. Garrett had never seen her look small before. For several seconds he stood motionless. Then he quietly turned around and walked back toward the house. He never announced himself, never interrupted, never let her know he had seen. The next morning, dawn arrived bright and cold. When Garrett entered the kitchen, Vivian was already there. Coffee simmered on the stove. Biscuits baked in the oven. Sunlight touched the edge of her face. She looked composed, rested, perfectly calm, as if nothing had happened, as if the woman beneath the moonlight had never existed. Garrett accepted the coffee she handed him. For a moment he studied her. Vivian simply lifted an eyebrow. "What?" "Nothing." He looked away. But something had changed. The woman who arrived yesterday wasn't merely stubborn, wasn't merely proud. She was carrying something heavy enough to break her in private. And for the first time since she stepped off that coach, Garrett Dawson found himself wondering who Vivian Brooks really was. Not the bride. Not the arrangement. The woman. The thought stayed with Garrett Dawson longer than he cared to admit. 3 days passed, then 5, then a week. Life at Broken Creek Ranch settled into a rhythm that somehow felt familiar and strange at the same time. Every morning, Vivian was already awake when he entered the kitchen. The coffee pot steamed softly on the stove. Biscuits cooled beneath a folded towel. The curtains were opened just enough to catch the first Montana sunlight. Yet nothing about her felt domestic in the way Garrett had expected. She did not hover. She did not seek approval. She simply did what needed doing. One chilly morning, Garrett came in carrying a saddle blanket that needed mending. Without looking up from her work, Vivian reached for it. "You tore this near the stirrup." Garrett paused. "How'd you know?" "The wear pattern." She turned the blanket over. "You ride heavier on your left side." For a moment, he simply stared. "You notice a lot." Vivian threaded a needle. "Someone should." Outside, the wind rattled the cottonwoods near Broken Creek. Autumn was creeping closer. The grass had started turning gold. One afternoon, Garrett found Vivian standing beside the north pasture fence. Her gaze followed the creek, or what was left of it. The water ran lower than it should have. Much lower. "You've been watching that stream for 3 days," he said. Vivian didn't turn. "It drops every afternoon." "So? So water doesn't disappear by itself." Garrett frowned. "It's been a dry year." She pointed downstream. "The banks are wet there." His eyes followed her finger. Sure enough, patches of mud darkened the grass. Vivian folded her arms. "Something's diverting water." Garrett exhaled through his nose. He wasn't used to people questioning ranch matters, especially newcomers. "You worried about my creek now?" "I'm worried about the horses." "The horses are fine. For now." That answer irritated him far more than it should have. He turned and walked away. Behind him, Vivian said nothing, which somehow irritated him even more. 2 days later, they rode into Cedar Bluff for supplies. The town sat beneath a pale blue sky streaked with high clouds. Wagons lined Main Street. The blacksmith's hammer rang somewhere behind the feed store. A freight wagon unloaded flour sacks outside Miller's General Store. Garrett tied his horse outside the bank. Vivian crossed toward the mercantile. Several women stood near the porch railing. Their conversation stopped as she approached. One of them glanced at Vivian's traveling dress. Another looked toward Garrett. Then they exchanged quiet smiles. Not kind ones. Garrett saw it happen. He stepped forward instinctively. Vivian caught the movement from the corner of her eye. A tiny shake of her head stopped him. The women continued talking. Low voices, carefully polite, the kind designed to be overheard. Garrett's jaw tightened. Vivian simply entered the store. 10 minutes later, she emerged carrying thread, lamp oil, and a small ledger book. Her expression hadn't changed. As they crossed the street, Garrett finally spoke. "You didn't hear them?" "I heard them." "And?" Vivian adjusted the parcel beneath her arm. "They wanted a reaction. Most folks would have given one." She looked toward the distant mountains. "I've spent too many years giving people exactly what they expected." The answer followed him all the way home. That evening, darkness settled early. A storm threatened somewhere beyond the western ridge. Garrett finished feeding the horses and headed toward the barn. A faint lantern glow caught his attention. Inside, Vivian sat on an overturned bucket. A torn saddle rested across her lap. Leather strips lay neatly beside her. Her sleeves were rolled to the elbows. A strand of hair had slipped loose near her cheek. She didn't know he was there. The barn remained quiet, except for the occasional sound of horses shifting in their stalls. Vivian worked patiently. Thread, needle, pull, repeat. No complaints, no dramatic sighs, no frustration. Just steady effort. Garrett stood watching longer than he meant to. Finally, she noticed him. "You need something?" He cleared his throat. "No." Her hands continued moving. The lantern painted warm light across the leather. Then why are you standing there? Garrett looked away. Didn't know you could repair saddles. Vivian smiled faintly. My uncle owned mules. That explained nothing, yet somehow it felt like enough. A comfortable silence settled between them. Not friendship. Not yet. But something less sharp than before. Later that night, Garrett entered the ranch office searching for a cattle receipt. The room smelled of paper, dust, and old leather. Account books lined the shelves. Maps covered one wall. The desk sat beneath a small oil lamp. He found the receipt quickly. What he didn't notice was the thin ledger left partially open on the corner of the desk. The following afternoon, Vivian entered the office looking for spare envelopes. The wind pushed softly against the windows. She opened a drawer, then another. Her hand brushed against the old ledger. The page lay open. A folded bank document rested inside. Normally, she would have ignored it. Instead, a date caught her attention. November 1st. Less than 3 months away. Vivian unfolded the paper. Her eyes moved slowly down the page, then stopped. She read it again, and again. The number hadn't changed. Neither had the signature. Garrett Dawson. Broken Creek Ranch. Outstanding loan balance. Payment due before winter. Failure to pay would result in seizure of property and assets. Vivian lowered the paper. Outside, a horse neighed near the corral. Wind rattled the office window. The ranch suddenly felt different. The house, the barn, the pastures. Everything sat beneath a shadow she hadn't seen before. Garrett had never mentioned a loan, never mentioned a deadline, never mentioned the possibility of losing everything. She carefully folded the document and returned it exactly where she'd found it. When she stepped outside, Garrett was repairing a gate near the barn. Sunlight caught the dust on his shirt. He looked up briefly. Their eyes met. For the first time since arriving in Montana, Vivian realized something. The man who appeared steady as stone was carrying a burden far heavier than he allowed anyone to see, and he was carrying it alone. The discovery stayed with Vivian for days. She never mentioned the loan, never asked about the bank papers, but once she knew they existed, she began noticing things she had missed before. The worn cuffs on Garrett's work coat, the way he counted feed receipts twice before putting them away, how he stood at the north pasture longer than necessary whenever he checked the creek. Winter was coming, and something was running out besides water. A week later, Garrett saddled his bay gelding before sunrise. A cold mist hung low over Broken Creek. The horse corrals stood quiet, except for the occasional snort of restless animals. Vivian stepped onto the porch carrying 2 tin cups of coffee. Garrett accepted one. Their fingers nearly touched. Both noticed. Neither mentioned it. The roundup may take 4 or 5 days, he said. That long? Maybe longer if the weather turns. She nodded. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Garrett reached into his coat pocket. A small brass key rested in his palm. The office. Vivian looked at him. The office? In case a supply order arrives, or a delivery receipt. She stared at the key. It wasn't just metal. It was trust. The first real sign of it. Slowly, she accepted it. I'll keep an eye on things. His gaze lingered half a second longer than necessary. I know you will. By noon, the riders were gone. Broken Creek felt strangely empty. The evenings grew quieter. The wind sounded louder around the house. 3 days passed. On the 4th morning, Vernon Hale arrived in Cedar Bluff. Everyone recognized him. The wealthiest ranch owner in the valley. Polished boots, expensive coat, a smile that rarely reached his eyes. Vivian first saw him outside the bank. He tipped his hat politely. Miss Brooks. Mr. Hale. His gaze drifted toward Broken Creek in the distance. Interesting place you've chosen. She said nothing. Vernon smiled. Folks are wondering how long you'll stay." The words sounded friendly. They were not. By evening, rumors had already spread through town. People whispered that Vivian had come west for Garrett's land, that she had somehow convinced him to trust her, that the arrangement would end badly. Vivian heard every version. She answered none of them. 2 nights later, a storm rolled across the valley. Wind slammed against the ranch house. Rain rattled the windows. Near midnight, a pounding erupted on the front door. Vivian opened it. 3 young ranch hands stood outside, soaked from head to toe. "Miss Brooks, what happened? The horses!" Her stomach dropped. She grabbed her coat and lantern. The corral gate stood wide open. More than 20 horses were already racing across the dark pasture. Lightning flashed above the hills. For one terrible second, she saw them. A moving river of frightened animals heading toward the ravine beyond the eastern ridge. "Get ropes!" she shouted. The men scattered. Rain whipped across her face. Mud sucked at her boots. The horses disappeared into darkness. Vivian climbed onto the nearest saddle horse and followed. The chase felt endless. Thunder rolled above the valley. Hooves pounded against soaked earth. One frightened mare veered sharply. The rope burned across Vivian's palms as she fought to redirect her. Pain shot through her hands. She nearly lost her seat, nearly lost the horse, nearly disappeared into the darkness beyond the ridge. But somehow the herd slowed. One animal, then another, then another. By dawn, the last horse stood safely behind the corral fence. Vivian slid from the saddle. Her hands trembled. Mud covered her skirt. Rainwater dripped from her hair. She sank onto the ground beside the fence, too exhausted to stand. A few minutes later, hoofbeats echoed down the road. The roundup riders were returning. Garrett spotted her immediately. He jumped from his horse before it fully stopped. The sight hit him hard. Vivian sat in the mud, both hands scraped and bleeding lightly from rope burns, her face pale from exhaustion. Behind her, every horse was home. Safe. What happened? One of the ranch hands explained everything. The open gate, the storm, the chase, the rescue. Garrett looked back at Vivian. For several seconds, he simply stared. Then he crossed the distance between them and pulled her into his arms. The embrace lasted only a moment, but it was enough. Enough for both of them to feel it. Enough for neither of them to know what to say afterward. Before either could speak, another horse appeared at the gate. A male rider. He carried a leather satchel. "Miss Brooks?" Vivian stepped forward. The rider handed her a sealed envelope. She froze the moment she saw the handwriting. Memphis. Someone from her past had found her. And suddenly, the storm no longer felt like the biggest thing coming toward Broken Creek Ranch. The envelope remained unopened through breakfast. It sat beside Vivian's coffee cup while the morning sun stretched across the kitchen table. Garrett noticed it every time he looked up. He also noticed she wasn't eating. By mid-morning, she carried the letter to the porch. The valley looked peaceful after the storm. Water dripped from fence rails. Clouds drifted slowly over the distant mountains. Vivian broke the seal. The handwriting pulled her backward, through years she had tried to leave behind. Memphis. Hot summers. Crowded streets. Church bells. The feeling of being watched every time she made a choice for herself. The letter came from her cousin Naomi. Short, careful, honest. The wealthy merchant who had once tried to force a marriage agreement upon Vivian had recently died. People were talking again. Old stories were resurfacing. Some now admitted that Vivian had been treated unfairly. Others still blamed her. Naomi ended the letter with one simple sentence. "You were brave to leave when the rest of us were afraid." Vivian folded the paper slowly. For a long time she stared at the mountains. Garrett found her there near sunset. He carried 2 cups of coffee, one for himself, one for her. He handed it over without asking questions. They sat in silence. The wind moved softly through the dry grass. Finally, Garrett spoke. "Bad news?" Vivian looked down at the folded letter. "Old news." He waited. She surprised herself by continuing. "Years ago, my family wanted me to marry a man with money." Garrett remained quiet. He wasn't cruel. She stared toward the horizon. But he wanted ownership more than partnership. The words drifted away on the wind. I said no. Garrett already knew the answer before she finished. They didn't like that. No. A faint smile touched her face. It turns out people become uncomfortable when a woman makes decisions for herself. That earned the smallest laugh from him, the first real laugh she'd heard. Then silence returned. Not uncomfortable silence. The kind that settles between two people beginning to trust each other. "You came all the way to Montana because of that?" Vivian shook her head. "No." She folded the letter again. "I came because I got tired of living where every room felt borrowed." Garrett looked at her. For the first time, he understood something important. Vivian had never traveled west searching for a husband. She had traveled west searching for a place where she could finally belong. The realization stayed with him long after she returned inside. 3 days later, trouble arrived. Not quietly, not indirectly, directly. A rider from Cedar Bluff reached the ranch shortly after noon. Garrett read the document twice, then a third time. His jaw tightened. Vivian watched from the porch. What happened? He handed her the paper. The bank notice carried an official seal. The outstanding loan had been sold. New holder, Vernon Hale. For several seconds, neither spoke. The autumn wind suddenly felt colder. He bought the debt. Garrett nodded. Looks that way. Vivian lowered the paper. The pieces finally fit together. The rumors, the pressure, the disappearing water, the interest in Broken Creek Ranch. Vernon didn't want payment. He wanted ownership. That evening, the ranch house remained unusually quiet. Garrett sat at the kitchen table studying figures beneath the oil lamp. Receipts, cattle records, feed expenses, numbers that refused to cooperate. Vivian entered the office for the first time since discovering the loan. She searched old shelves, drawers, boxes, anything connected to the ranch's history. Near midnight, she found a wooden document case tucked behind a stack of territorial maps. Dust covered the lid. Inside rested papers belonging to Garrett's father. Land records, tax receipts, survey notes. Then one document caught her eye. An agreement signed years earlier between the Dawson family and the Territorial Water Commission. Vivian read every line, then read it again. Her pulse quickened. The agreement granted legal access to a spring located upstream from Broken Creek, a spring Vernon Hale had recently begun controlling. If the document remained valid, much of his leverage disappeared. Vivian carried the papers into the kitchen. Garrett looked exhausted. She laid the agreement in front of him. His eyes narrowed. "What is this?" "Read it." The room fell silent except for the ticking clock. Halfway through the document, Garrett straightened. By the final page, he was standing. "I haven't seen this since I was a boy." Vivian looked at him carefully. Then maybe Vernon was counting on that. Hope appeared for the first time in weeks. Small, fragile, but real. The hearing was scheduled for the following day at the church in Cedar Bluff. The entire valley would be there. Vernon intended to claim the ranch. Garrett intended to fight. That night, the sky hung clear above Montana. Stars stretched across the darkness. Vivian stood alone beside the corral. The horses shifted quietly nearby. Footsteps approached. Garrett. For a moment, neither spoke. Then he stopped beside her, close enough to hear her breathing, close enough to feel how much had changed since the stagecoach arrived. Vivian. She looked up. His expression carried none of its usual certainty. only honesty, raw and unguarded. I spent years thinking I knew exactly what kind of woman I needed. The wind lifted the brim of his hat. I was wrong. Vivian's heartbeat stumbled. Garrett reached into his pocket. A small ring rested in his palm. Simple gold. Nothing extravagant. Everything sincere. Marry me. The words settled between them. No audience, no grand speech, just a cowboy beneath Montana's stars. For a long moment, Vivian said nothing. Not because she didn't care, because she cared too much. Tomorrow could take everything. The ranch, the future, the fragile home both of them had begun building. She looked toward the dark outline of Broken Creek Ranch, then back at Garrett. Her voice came softly. If we lose tomorrow, none of this matters. Garrett stood motionless. The ring remained in his hand, and neither of them knew whether she had just refused him, or whether she was more afraid of losing him than she was willing to admit. Morning arrived cold and clear. A thin layer of frost covered the grass around Broken Creek Ranch. Neither Garrett nor Vivian mentioned the proposal during the wagon ride into Cedar Bluff. The silence between them wasn't angry. It was careful, like two people carrying something fragile across rough ground. The church stood near the center of town, its white paint weathered by years of Montana winters. Wagons filled the yard. Ranchers gathered near the steps. Farmers, merchants, and townsfolk crowded the entrance. Everyone knew why they were there. Vernon Hale had made certain of that. Inside, sunlight filtered through tall windows and stretched across the wooden floorboards. Vernon sat near the front beside the bank manager. He looked confident. Too confident. When Garrett and Vivian entered, dozens of heads turned. Vernon smiled. Mr. Dawson, Miss Brooks. Garrett ignored him. The hearing began shortly afterward. The county recorder sat behind a long table near the altar. Documents were placed before him. Mortgage papers, land records, bank agreements. For nearly an hour, Vernon spoke. He spoke about debt, about business, about obligations. And by the end of it, the room felt heavy. Because the facts seemed simple. Garrett owed money. The debt belonged to Vernon. The ranch could be taken. Then Vivian stood. A murmur passed through the church. She carried a worn leather folder under one arm. Her hands were steady. Her voice was steady too. I'd like these documents entered into the record. The county recorder accepted them. Several pages later, his eyebrows rose, then rose again. The room grew quieter. Vivian presented the water rights agreement Garrett's father had signed years earlier. She produced survey maps, territorial records, payment receipts. Then she introduced one final witness, a retired county deputy named Samuel Pike, an older man with silver hair and a stiff knee. Years earlier, he had witnessed the original agreement himself. His testimony changed everything. The recorder reviewed the evidence. The bank manager reviewed it. Even Vernon reviewed it. And the confidence slowly disappeared from his face, because the truth had become impossible to ignore. The spring above Broken Creek legally belonged to the Dawson property. Without control of that water, much of Vernon's plan collapsed. The recorder finally set down the documents. His voice echoed through the church. The mortgage remains valid. Garrett's shoulders tightened. Then the recorder continued. But evidence suggests deliberate interference regarding water access and property valuation. A ripple moved through the crowd. The recorder looked directly at Vernon. The transfer of ownership is denied pending further review. Silence. Then another sentence. The Dawson Ranch remains under Garrett Dawson's control. For a moment, nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Then the room erupted. People stood. Voices filled the church. Hands slapped shoulders. Even the bank manager looked relieved. Vernon Hale rose from his seat. His face had gone pale. Without another word, he walked out. No dramatic confrontation. No threats. just a defeated man leaving through the church doors. Sunlight flooded the entrance behind him. When the doors closed again, the room seemed brighter. Garrett turned toward Vivian. Neither spoke. Neither needed to. Everything they had survived stood between them. The storm, the rumors, the debt, the fear, all of it. Later, outside the church, the crowd slowly gathered around the front steps. Someone asked Garrett to say a few words. At first he refused. Then he glanced toward Vivian and changed his mind. He removed his hat. The afternoon wind stirred through the cottonwoods lining Main Street. I've spent most of my life believing I knew exactly what I wanted. The crowd quieted. Garrett looked down briefly, then back up. When I sent for a bride, I thought I wanted someone quiet. A few people exchanged glances. I thought I wanted someone who wouldn't change my life. His gaze found Vivian, standing a few yards away, watching him, listening. The same way she had listened since arriving in Cedar Bluff. Garrett smiled softly. Turns out I was wrong. A few chuckles moved through the crowd. He continued. I thought strength looked one way. His voice grew steadier. But strength rode through a storm to save my horses. Vivian lowered her eyes. I thought courage meant standing alone. Garrett shook his head. But courage is standing beside someone. The churchyard had become completely silent. I thought love meant finding someone who fit into the life I already had. His eyes never left Vivian now. But Vivian Brooks taught me something better. The wind lifted the edge of her coat. Garrett stepped toward her, slowly, deliberately. The same way he had approached a frightened horse all his life, with honesty, with patience, with respect. He reached into his pocket. The same ring appeared once more. This time there was no uncertainty in his voice. Vivian. The entire town seemed to disappear. Will you marry me? A long moment passed. The mountains stood blue beyond Cedar Bluff. A wagon creaked somewhere down the street. The church bell moved softly in the breeze. Vivian looked at the people around her, then at Broken Creek Ranch in the distance, then at Garrett, the man who had begun as a stranger, the man who had become home. A smile touched her face, small at first, then brighter, yes. The crowd broke into applause. Someone cheered. Someone whistled. Garrett laughed for the first time in months, maybe years, and when he slipped the ring onto her finger, it felt less like a beginning and more like something finally finding its rightful place. 1 year later, the valley looked different. The creek ran strong again. Broken Creek Ranch had recovered. New fencing stretched across the north pasture. The horse herd had grown. Near town, a small schoolhouse stood beneath a cottonwood tree. Inside, children practiced their reading while Vivian moved between the desks. The final bell rang near sunset. After the children left, one little girl remained behind. 6 years old. Dark curls, a second-hand blue dress, an orphan who had recently found a home. Vivian helped her sound out the last line on a page. The child grinned proudly when she finished. Outside, Garrett stood beside the fence. His hat rested in his hands. The evening sun painted the Montana Valley gold. He watched the two of them through the open doorway, the little girl laughing, Vivian smiling, the schoolhouse glowing in the last light of day. A year earlier, she had arrived carrying a worn suitcase and a lifetime of disappointment. Now she belonged. Not because someone gave her permission, not because she had been rescued, because she had built something real. Garrett caught her eye across the yard. Neither spoke. He simply tipped his hat. Vivian smiled back. And for the first time in her life, the future no longer felt borrowed. It felt like home. As the sun settled behind the Montana hills and the last light stretched across Broken Creek Ranch, it became clear that Vivian hadn't traveled west to find a husband. She had traveled west to find a place where she could stand without fear, speak without permission, and be loved without having to become someone else. And maybe that's why this story stays with us. Because if we're honest, most of us have known what it feels like to arrive somewhere carrying old wounds nobody can see. We've all wondered whether there was a place in this world where we could finally put down the weight we've carried for too long. Imagine standing where Vivian stood that first day, a stranger, far from home, unsure whether the next door would open or close. Then imagine finding someone who doesn't save you by taking away your strength, but by recognizing it. Maybe that's what real love looks like. Not control, not perfection. Just two people choosing each other again and again through storms, setbacks, doubts, and long winters. And perhaps the quiet lesson hidden in this story is that healing often begins the moment we stop searching for someone to complete us and start believing we are worthy of being loved exactly as we are. If this story touched something in your heart, I'd love to hear where you're watching from or what part stayed with you the most. And if you enjoy these heartfelt Western love stories filled with hope, second chances, and the kind of people who leave a mark on your soul, I hope you'll join me again. There are many more trails ahead, and many more stories waiting just beyond the next horizon.